This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 24 of season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Charlie Wolcott. This is the third part in a 4-part series with Charlie. Charlie studied computer science at the University of Texas at El Paso, and he's certified to teach math and physics for both middle and high school. He's also a graduate from the Sharp Institute for Biblical Worldview Studies of the Creation Truth Foundation, where he was commissioned to teach about the importance of having a biblical worldview. Charlie's always had a passion for the Lord, and he was raised in the mission field. He helped his parents for over 2 decades as they served with international family missions, and he's the leader of a Bible study group at his church. He's a member of Worldview Warriors, and he speaks at conferences, church events, and Christian schools. He's a teacher and author of several books, such as 10 Reasons to Believe the Bible and The God of the Psalms. Charlie has Asperger's syndrome, which is a high-functioning form of autism. And when he was 6 years old, he was told that he'd never run, and that he'd probably never live on his own, drive, or go to college. His testimony did not turn out that way, though, as he currently is teaching AP Physics, which is considered to be one of the most difficult of all the AP classes. And so by grace, Charlie has done all of those things and more to the glory of God. And now, without further ado, good morning, Charlie. How was your day, and how are you doing?
Yeah, it's been awesome doing this with you. So it's like, it's going to be awesome, but it's almost over.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Fantastic to have you on Current Topics in Science once more. And since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. In each part of this 4-part series, we'll be looking at an article called Radiometric Dating Puts Pieces of the Past in Context. Here's how. The article continues by saying, in this approach, scientists measure the amount of a particular isotope in a sample and then compare that with the amounts of various daughter products that form as the isotope decays. By taking the ratio of these amounts, or even the ratio of amounts of daughter products alone, and then running the clock backward, researchers can estimate when radioactive decay first began, that is, when the object formed. Scientists still have to be careful. A radiometric clock can be reset if either the original isotope or its daughter products are lost to the environment. Robust crystals called zircons, for example, are long-lasting and present in many rocks, but extreme temperatures can drive lead, a daughter product of radioactive uranium and thorium, out of the crystal. So this article mentioned that scientists need to exercise caution when measuring isotopes, as it's possible for the clock to be reset or for the daughter elements to be driven out. Charlie, can you please expand upon these issues in radiometric dating?
So we meant that this article, this particular quote in this article, reveals 2 critical aspects of radiometric dating, among many others. Okay, and again, we have touched on these in our previous 2 sessions, but let's kind of zoom in a little bit more here. The first issue is when the system is what we could call locked in place, quote unquote, and that's pretty much when the clock is essentially set. And the other issue is the issue of leaching, which is the ability or inability of parts of the system being able to leak in or out of the system. Okay, so what does it mean for a clock to be set? Okay, so pretty much what they're talking about is the initial conditions in which a system can be reliably trusted to give accurate time. Okay, that's pretty much the gist of what they're aiming for. So if you have a grandfather clock, and of course not many people knows what those are anymore, but grandfather clocks have to be set, and you can also use your digital watch as well. But you have to set your clock in order to be able to actually start recording time with any kind of accuracy. And something goes off with that clock, then you have to kind of recalibrate it, reset it, and then you can start measuring time all over again. That's kind of the main idea here. So with radiometric dating methods, scientists are looking for when the conditions within that geologic rock, or which often is real small, have ceased to be changing. And so what they have left is just the decay process and this parent isotope decaying, and that's the only factor that's actually changing within that rock system. That's what they're looking for. Okay, so these which conditions they're looking for, they can vary per method that's being examined. So two quick examples. We'll look at potassium argon, because that's a really easy one to see. This depends on what happens when fresh lava hardens. Because theoretically, liquid lava will allow any argon, which is a noble gas, to escape. And so when the rock hardens, any new argon that's produced from the radioactive decay will determine that age of the rock. Okay, and that's how that clock is set for potassium argon. And if that rock would be remelted in any case, that would reset the clock, and then they'd have to basically restart over. And we touched on this briefly when we talked about the Mount St. Helens lavas that were potassium argon dated. And this is one of the excuses that they had for the discrepant data that Steve Austin came up with. And then carbon dating, that goes with a different system, but it's different because living creatures constantly bring in carbon-14 as they breathe in and out and as they eat. The radioactive carbon becomes infused in their bones, into the pottery, into wood, anything that can take in carbon as it's being formed. And so when an animal or plant dies, it's no longer able to intake carbon-14, and that's when they would say the clock is set. Any new carbon-14 introduced into that system would be a factor of contamination. And that is if you have absolutely ideal conditions. So that's pretty much what it means for the clock to be set. And then the other aspect is leaching. Okay, and so the system of the decay has to be locked in place so that no outside influence can affect it. One experiment or a model that science teachers use to showcase radioactive decay is they use M&Ms. Okay, they give students a bowl of M&Ms, and so at every time period they pull out half of the M&Ms in that bowl and put it someplace else. Okay, so that's basically how they can visualize what's happening with these decay processes. Well, leaching, what leaching would do is if there's an outside influence that would add M&Ms into the system or take additional M&Ms out. Okay, so that's kind of how that's what leaching does. And so, in order for these methods to work, you have to have what they call a closed system. There cannot be any outside influences, only just the radioactive decay. And this is a severe problem for radiometric dating methods. And if you just understand chemistry, it's really just by knowing chemistry, it's really easy for many of these unstable isotopes to exchange in and out in an aqueous solution. Okay, because Douglas Sharp, who is he's one of our great creation allies, he made a comment that a lot of these isotopes that are part of these experiments are in the alkali earth metal series. Okay, and so on your periodic table, that's the first two columns. Those two columns are it's really easy to change out one element for another in the same column, especially in a water-based solution. So we have a thing called the flood, which definitely gives that scenario and situation something that we definitely have to explore. John Woodmorath, in his book, The Mythology of Modern Dating Methods, and I'm going to be quoting from him quite a bit in this session, he points out that the scientific literature is filled with studies of how leaching has indeed played a major factor, especially in aqueous solutions and relatively low-level temperatures, way lower than what the secular scientists are telling us. So, in a nutshell, while scientists absolutely do have to take extreme caution about these factors, what they're often failed to see or recognize is that these factors are well outside their control. So they have no really real way of being able to tell whether rocks have actually been through these potential system-altering conditions, because they weren't there to witness these conditions the entire time. Okay, now they have done some impressive studies in the labs, but my question keeps coming up about these lab studies. Do the lab experience reflect the conditions in the real world? And the answer I'm finding is that it's an emphatic no. What they do in the lab, what they're measuring in the labs, do not reflect what's actually happening to these isotopes as they're found in the real world.
So thank you for bringing up those points, Charlie. And as we did in our last two sessions, Before we delve more into the subject of the problems with radiometric dating, we can take a look at science as a whole. And so now you and I, we both love science and the scientific method. As we saw in our previous session, scientism is not science. In other words, Charlie, in the scientific community today, is it the case that paradigm and not evidence are driving the discussion?
That is absolutely the case. And I would argue without question that is the case. The quote that you shared stated that without the dating of events, without the dating of our events and without our objects, we don't have a narrative. Okay, that was our opening quote for our first session. And so this whole thing is about a narrative. It's all about a history. It's all about answering the question, where did I come from? Okay, and we're going to see here in this discussion that we're going to see in this session that this discussion is not at all driven by science or by facts, but it's actually by the paradigm. It's driven by the history that the people want to believe. Okay, we have to remember that science is a tool. It is not an epistemology. Okay? And if I were to be quoted in this session, that would be a statement worth quoting. Science is a tool, not an epistemology. Okay? It does not give the definition of reality. And we've lost that notion today. So what's happened as a result of this? Okay, there have been numerous news media outlets have gotten word that approximately 50 papers, if not more, are completely false. They've had to be retracted. 50% of science papers, and the list of science papers that have to be retracted or are shown to be invalid are increasing at enormous rates. Okay, and so a lot of that has to do with they're discovering that what was initially published really isn't so. There's one seculars. I don't remember if he was just a layman guy or actual scientist, but said that if these radiometric dating methods were to be proven false, pretty much the entire geologic field of scientists would all have to resign because everything that they have said is wrong. And I'm not entirely saying that would be a bad idea at this point, because they've all been taught a false paradigm from the get-go. And then there's Breitbart put on our article, and I know Breitbart's not exactly everyone's favorite source. It's that they do have their biases and they're more conservative, but they reported that just 1% of science papers actually demonstrate usage of the scientific method. Just 1% actually use the scientific method. Okay, one thing I did just last week to end my semester with my students, and I did just as an extra credit final activity, is a science paper I found from 4 years ago that was sent to 9 different science journals. 4 of them published it, including one at UT Austin, and the whole thing was filled with nothing but Star Wars references. It's absolutely hilarious. But there were 4 journals that actually published it, including one at UT Austin. So obviously they didn't read the paper. The paper's opening abstract was factually wrong by citing mitochondria as the source of various human diseases. And this was before they actually switched to saying mitochondria to midichlorians, which is the Star Wars explanation for the Force. And this student didn't get the Star Wars references, but she actually paid attention to her biology classes. And just by reading the abstract, she's like, wait a second, this doesn't make sense at all. And so people aren't actually reading the papers. Okay, they're getting the media published results, okay, from these papers, and that's what they're going with. So obviously something is very, very wrong with the scientific community. It's no longer actually practicing proper science. And the peer review process itself has become mob rule. And it's you agree with the paradigm or you don't get published. A couple quotes here. Phil Hills and Norman Nevin from the book Should Christians Embrace Evolution states that many believe that science is an open environment with free exchange of ideas that will always follow the evidence wherever it leads. That may be ideal, but that is not necessarily what happens in practice. Thomas Kuhn, the historian in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, argued that scientists work with a set of ideas to inform and develop their research until they reach a point where it is impossible to continue with that hypothesis. Until this point of impossibility arises, evidence challenging the prevailing hypothesis can be ignored, silenced, or indeed modified. Okay, they are sticking with the notion of millions of years until the point where it's absolutely completely impossible to continue with it. And what they are doing is that they are ignoring evidence that goes against it. They are silencing any evidence that goes against it, And we're going to find out in this session that in some cases they're actually changing the evidence. Okay, and then with peer review, John Whitmore in the Methodology of Modern Dating Methods, okay, says this. Let's examine and demonstrate how this peer pressure, and he's pointing out that this is not really some sort of nefarious conspiracy theory, serves to repress alternate viewpoints within each of these respective areas of study. So, and then Whitmore goes on to give two quotes of people who have been through the system. So a guy named Saul in 1986 stated that the hardcore belief in plate tectonics is protected from direct assault by auxiliary hypotheses that are still being generated. And then a guy named Hamilton in 1988 said, then as now, peer review can represent the tyranny of the majority. I have run the peer review gauntlet perhaps 100 times. My papers describing and interpreting geology in more or less conventional terms have progressed smoothly, whereas publications of my manuscripts challenging accepted concepts have often been impeded and occasionally blocked. Okay, so what we're seeing here, that the peer review process seeks to protect the paradigm, not follow the evidence. Okay, and these are, and we're getting quotes from non-creation scientists that are, and in some cases are openly admitting this.
Well, actually, Charlie, that kind of brings us to our next question. And this might be a little bit of a sensitive point, so I want to preface it with this. So you and I, we're both human beings. You know, we've made mistakes, we've sinned, and we have been irrational at times in our lives. So this next question, it's not meant to be a put down, it's not intended to be an insult. This comes from a place of curiosity and a desire to learn more about how radioactive dating methods work. And so the question is this, Charlie. Is the reasoning behind radiometric dating sound? In other words, are there fallacies that are being used to promote these radioactive dating methods?
Yeah, so again, I do. Yeah, again, we do want to be respectful for people that have really have poured their lives into studying these methods. However, we have to call out what we're seeing as to what it is. We have to be honest as to what we're dealing with. There are some people that really are seeking to do what they're doing with as much honesty and integrity as they know how to do. Okay, and what I see instead are all these kinds of fallacies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a variety of different quotes that describes how these methods are being promoted and defended, as well as some of my interactions with some of these people. Okay, so John Whitmore, a very, very meticulous scientist. He wrote his book Methodology of Modern Dating Methods in 1999, but he opens up by instead of having to go by case studies, which he basically summarizes them into all the cases into three major fallacies, and it basically gives us an excellent rundown for the test that we can use for our baloney detectors when we come across these arguments. Okay, so the first fallacy he calls credit dating methods blame nature. Okay, and so what he says is, indeed, the fallacious reasoning used by apologists for isotopic dating boils down to three central fallacies. The first one is CDMBN, credit dating methods for ostensible successes and blame nature for failures. And it's a heads I win, tails you lose. This exempts isotopic dating itself from rational criticism, i.e., for example, the dating method is never wrong, only the initial conditions have not been met. And it protects it from falsification, which we talked about in our last session on test casing. So what he's saying here is that very often what we're going to see is when these methods give results that perfectly illustrate the deep time models, and that the dates give accurate results, the dating method is the cause of that, and it is correct. But if the dating system gives a erroneous data and a wrong answer according to the secular deep time paradigm, then obviously nature created a problem for this dating method, and that was the problem. And what you never ever see is the dating method itself actually being examined. Okay, so that's one fallacy that they use. The second fallacy is the appeal to marginalization. Okay, and Wilbur continues. The second fallacy is the ATM, appeal to a marginalization, there we go, fallacy. It attempts to belittle the significance of contrary evidence by spinning it as rare and or occurring only under limited geologic circumstances. A classic use of the ATM is the often repeated false claim about a few malfunctioning watches. So, okay, a more subtle use of it, however, involves the reluctance or refusal to acknowledge the broad implications of a discrepancy. It's really interesting how the secularists, when but when you ask them like what will change their mind, they will say just one piece of evidence. And Bill Nye boasted this proudly in his debate with Ken Ham. One piece of evidence would change his mind about evolution. And he was given lots of evidence, not only in that debate, but then Bill Nye went to the Ark Encounter. He saw lots of evidence, and he refused to even look at one piece of it. And what did he use? And partly he used the appeal to marginalization. Well, that one doesn't count. It's an outlier. It's an outlier. It's just a minor error. Doesn't count. We have all these other models that work instead. And then the third one is the appeal to technicalities. A third fallacy is the ATT, appeal to technicalities fallacy. An unwelcome date is rejected, and its rejection is excused on some technicality, usually an after the fact one. And then Wimmer goes into a study of how they often will reject rocks that show traces of alteration, but he points out that almost every rock shows alteration and cites a source for that. There will be almost no rocks left to date if the hidden premise behind this fallacy were taken to its logical conclusion. Furthermore, as we shall see, uniformitarians have no problem accepting results from slightly altered and often more than slightly altered rock, so long as it agrees with their ideas. Thanks to the widespread use of the ATT fallacy, all isotope dates are trial balloons to be accepted or rejected and rationalized at will. And this is what we're seeing. Anytime a radiometric dating method result comes in, the scientists don't accept or reject it based on the scientific results. They accept them or reject it at will based entirely on whether it agrees with their story. And so Whittemore continues to ask whether these methods were regularly tested. So this kind of follows up with what we discussed in our last session. So the myth. Historically speaking, the overall validity of isotopic dating methods have been very rigorously established prior to their recognition as such. So Whittemore continues. Reality check. Whatever the degree of critical experimentation that had in fact pre-existed their general use, one could make a case that in actuality, isotopic dating methods and their results had been accepted rather uncritically because the results seemed to fit in with uniformitarian ideas about the great antiquity of the Earth. Far from being rigorously tested, the unspoken attitude in uniformitarian geochronology seems and still seems to be the follows. Use whatever dating method you have that seems to substantiate the belief that rocks are millions to billions of years old until some better dating method comes along. Then use that method. Okay. One of the things that I've also seen is that anytime a dating method tends to be regularly rejected or regularly show erroneous data, they see that they will occasionally actually reject the full method. And one of the things that they'll say is that, well, that method never gave reliable results to begin with. And I'm like, wait a second. 10 years ago, you were proclaiming that method as absolute fact that you don't dare question that. And now you're saying they never gave reliable results to begin with? Something's not adding up here. And so again, what we see is that the secularists, they don't care about the method. They don't care about the data. They just care about not 6,000 years. They care about their paradigm. So Whittemore continues. Since all these serious problems had been discovered long after dating methods in question had enjoyed their widespread use, it could hardly be claimed that they had been rigorously checked before this widespread use. So when confronted with this evidence, apologists for isotopic dating changed their tune. Having been exposed in their earlier made blustery claims about the wonderful reliability of isotopic dating, they now give us a song and dance about the fact that they are the ones who discovered the flaws in those dating methods. To give a hyperbolic example, this is like an arsonist who sets a building on fire, calls the fire department to report the fire he set, and then has the audacity to proclaim himself the hero for having reported the fire. If they had done their science properly before the widespread use of these methods, they would have caught these flaws from the get-go, and these methods never would have gone rolling, and they would have gone going, because they would have seen that the flaws were there the whole time. But again, they're not being driven by the method; they're being driven by the paradigm. One of the other things the fallacies they use is storytelling. This is from Burning Cups in Rethinking Radiometric Dating. Okay, so he gives an example here. Finally, the measured isochron age of amphibolite rock from Southeast India gave an age of 481 million years using the rubidium-strontium method, but an age of 824 million years using the Sumerian neodymium method. So researchers explained away the obvious disagreement by claiming the older age was the time in which the rocks underwent metamorphism, while the younger age results from a later heating of the rocks. How do they know this time sequence? Can they time travel? Are they using unknowns to explain unknowns? This is blind faith wrapped up in philosophical premise, not science. Another thing they do is they censor things. Okay, so in 2012, a group of scientists did a separate dinosaur carbon-14 study than the one that I mentioned with that ICR did with Brian Thomas and Vance Nelson, and they each found that these dinosaur bones had a range of 22,000 to 39,000 year range. So very similar to what Vance Nelson with ICR and Brian Thomas with ICR figured out. And then they presented their material to the Western Pacific Geophysics Conference in 2012. After their presentation, they received a letter from their findings saying that their findings were obviously wrong because of contamination, and they should have known that, and that the bones could not be younger because they were dated to be millions of years old. Therefore, their entire presentations, their credentials, everything that they were there for were pulled from the conference as though they never presented or were at the conference. They went by the paradigm and saying, hey, this evidence contradicts our paradigm. We can't accept it. These guys have to be out. That's censorship. And then they changed the data. A very good case study of this is regarding a skull 1470, which was found in the KBS Tufts in Kenya. Okay, so skull 1470, which is just the label they gave a human skull that they found, along with other Stone Age tools, was discussed in great detail in the book Bones of Contention by Martin Lubenow. However, this is in the appendix, and it was only in the first edition. And what we're going to see is that not only do we see excessive amounts of circular reasoning, but we also see that they were literally willing to change the data. Okay, so the KBS Tufts, where these Tufts where all this was taking place in Kenya, is originally dated to be about 212 to 230 million years old, prior to the human skull being found. And then they found other bones and other animal fossils. And then Fitch and Miller did a study in 1970 in the KBS Tufts, and they changed the dates to 2.61 million years old. Okay, that's a scale factor. That's a complete factor of 100 times. Okay, so just because they found some fossils, they changed the dating from 212 to 230 to 2.6 million years, just based on some of the fossils they found. Okay, so this was a study done in 1970. In 1974, Fitch and Miller did some more studies, and then they also came up with the age range of 2.61 million years. But what isn't said, is said by the popular media, is that in the second paper by Fitch and Miller in 1974, they cited their original study in 1970 to be their primary source for that. A guy named Maglio also did some studies with some more of these fossils, and also citing the 1970 Fitch and Miller study to be back in, also got a age of 2.61 million years old. So we're seeing multiple studies claim to be independent. They're all saying the same story, but they all seem to have the same source too. Brock and Isaac also looking at paleomagnetic structures and looking at different fossils and other stuff. They did their own independent study, also saying 2.16 million years old. Okay, and again, their paper cites Fitch and Miller in 1970 being the original source. And so, and what we're seeing here is Ian Juby in his presentation goes through this entire circular reasoning argument where everything is all comes out and points back to the same original source, which is Fitch and Miller in 1970, all saying 2.61 million years old. And then Skull 1470 shows up. Skull 1470 is a human skull that's that again, according to the rock layer, is dated to be 2.61 million years old. That's way too old for evolutionary timeline. And so the entire evolutionary paradigm went up to Fitch and Miller saying these dates have to be wrong because this skull is too old. And Fitch and Miller said, hey, we've got the discovery of the oldest human fossil. And so there was a big war about this, and ultimately they had to change the dates from 2.61 million years old to 2.6 million years to 1.7 in order to fit with the evolutionary story. So they are literally changing the data to match the story.
You know, Charlie, actually speaking of, creationism versus evolutionism, You earlier talking about worldviews. So worldviews, I remember I heard this analogy where they're sort of like colorized glasses that make you see the world in a particular shade. But, all of us have our own biases, including you and I, so we each have our own worldview, and we're seeing the world in a particular shade. So how is it exactly that one tries to separate, say, the paradigm narratives from the actual data with regard to radiometric dating?
That's a very important question, and I'm just gonna be honest. It's almost impossible to do it. Okay, yeah, and so yeah, we do have those lenses, and Ancient Genesis does a real good job of kind of illustrating that. We're all looking at the same data, we're all looking at the same evidence, but we all have that different worldview from which we're seeing things. Let's be dead honest here. We creationists are not different than the secularists. We too have our own biases. We have our own lenses that we use it this way. So we have to understand this. Data doesn't speak. Okay, it just is. Evidence doesn't speak. It's scientists who have voices. It's the scientists who have biases, who are interpreting things and reporting what they want said, who do it. And we do it too. We do it too. Okay. The difference is that we know what it is, we know why, and we know why it is. And and we're not afraid to say that this is what our biases is. We have to be upfront and state what our assumptions are going into the discussions in order to be able to have an honest evaluation. The secularists, they really hate groups like ICR and AIG for having a statement of faith, quote unquote, that proclaims the Bible as the supreme authority. Okay, but what they're doing is that they're laying out like this is where we're coming from. This is our position. This is our assumptions. The Bible is the Word of God. That's our framework. They are stating their assumptions from the get-go. The secularists have their own biases too. They have their own statement of faith, and that's basically the creeds of secular humanism, of naturalism. Just very few of them actually admit that that's what's going on. Very few of them recognize that's what's going on. Okay, Ian Juby has a really good example of kind of this situation here. In his Complete Creation series, in episodes 11, he addresses the geologic column, and he really opened my eyes to some things. So when we talk about the geologic column, what do we tend to picture? Okay, usually what we picture is rocks stacked on top of each other, each with their labels, their names, each with the different types of fossils that we find in them, and then we find ages that are associated with them. That's generally what the public thinks about when they hear the term geologic column, purely from an evolutionary perspective. What we label it comes from our worldview. Okay, rocks just are, and they're there. That's obvious. Okay, there are fossils there. That's obvious. How did they get there? When were they laid down? That's the history that we are debating in between. We're not debating about the science. We're not debating about geological processes. We're debating about histories. And so we have to recognize that no matter what we say, we have this paradigm that they have. We have this paradigm that we have. That's where the debate is. And so ultimately the question is, which story holds up? So can we separate the narrative from the actual data? It's possible, but it's almost impossible. And the only way you can do the only way it is possible is to be completely honest about with what your assumptions and what your biases and what your worldview actually is. That's the only way you can actually separate the paradigm narrative from the actual data. And I rarely do I see evolutionists actually be upfront about what their biases are, what their assumptions are, what their paradigm is before going into the data.
So I think those are excellent tips to keep in mind, Charlie. And to change gears again, I'd like to hearken back to the subjects raised in our previous sessions. So Charlie, not everybody shares your view on the matter of radiometric dating. And so when discussing these objections and these concerns with those who do hold to the radiometric dating methods, what are your thoughts on the common responses that you often get?
Based on the common responses I get, in a way, it often makes me sad to the point where I'll pity these guys, especially the laymen that are only parroting what they've been taught. They have no clue what's going on behind the scenes. So one response that I get is that they accuse us of thinking that the entire scientific community is conspiring to keep the real stuff a secret. So, is that really so? So, Wimmer actually addresses this one in his book, Mythology of Modern Dating Methods. So, the myth. If isotopic dating methods are false, some sort of massive conspiracy would have to be in existence to suppress this fact. Reality check. A conspiracy is not needed for the simple reason that peer pressure within geology are sufficient. Peer pressures within geology are sufficient to dissuade and suppress any potential dissent. Particular isotopic dates and interpretations of them come and go, but the central belief in their overall validity and in the validity of the multi-billion-year age of the Earth is never open to serious re-examination. Any and all discrepant data is simply explained away as part of the very geologic methodology of interpreting isotopic results. Accuracy often takes a backseat to a consensus mentality among uniformitarian geochronologists. This makes it all the more unnecessary for conspiracy to exist in order to discourage the appearance of divergent thinking. So that's kind of what's going on here. Okay, the only conspiracy that's going on is spiritual. It's satanic. It's the world system that's behind the scenes. It's not these people, for the most part. Okay. There are a few scientists that do recognize that there are issues, but all you really need is just simple peer pressure, and you get the majority of the people to converge, because that's the way humans tend to be. At the same time, at the way that the defenses of these methods are given, it's hard to wonder if there is a conspiracy, because there's so much blind faith involved in these methods, and it's so ingrained into the general scientific literature. That they actually have the impression that if we question their dating methods, we're questioning the entirety of science. If you question evolution, if you question deep time, it's as though you're challenging gravity. But there's a problem with gravity. If you don't believe in gravity, we can have a thing called experimentation, where you could actually go test the theory of gravity. Okay, and you can go check it out. You can't check out these dating methods. There's no way to validate them. Okay, and every time we ask for validation, they give us anything except scientific validation. I had one guy that he claims to be a Christian, but he believes in an old Earth, and he says he believes all the core doctrines of Christianity, and he does teach teach and believe that with Adam, death came to all men. So I gave him scientific data that puts human fossils, human DNA, prior to any time frame that Adam could have lived. He danced all over the place, questioning anything from the definition of human to anything, but he would not dare question the dating method results. My thoughts on these responses point to how much, as a society, we have completely replaced our trust in God and replaced that with our trust in modern man experts. Okay, and so the idea of actually checking out what we're hearing is almost completely gone in this country, and this is true in theological circles too. So, to kind of conclude this point, the authors of the Grand Canyon Monument to an Ancient Earth, it was written by 11 different geology experts, mostly PhDs and some masters, but they made the statement that really caught my attention. The practice of real-life science is much like figuring out the correct passageway through a maze. Not those printed mazes where you can see from the start where the exit lies, but one you find yourself inside of, where the exit can only be found by experimenting with different routes. And so for those of you who have ever been through a core maze, it's the same notion, only you don't have the map. So these guys are saying, we don't know what we're doing. We're making these up as we go. We're lost in this maze, and we don't have a map. And the whole time they did this, they were mocking they're mocking the flood geologists for starting with their answer, quote unquote, or for us for starting with our answers, quote unquote. And I'm like, wait a second. To use this analogy, we're using the map to the maze. God gave us a map to the maze. It's called the Bible. That's the map to the maze. That's the guideline. That's the clues of how we can figure out what's going on, how we define our reality, how we determine our past. God gave us all that. He did not give it in scientific details, and that's fine. But he gave us the map. He gave us the framework. And so, are there mistakes that we make? Absolutely. We run into dead mazes by doing the map, by doing the maze with the map. We turn and find dead ends too. But we know it's a dead end because we can see the map of the maze. And these guys hate the fact that we're using the map. because the map tells them that they are wrong. They made a wrong turn a long time ago. They're never going to find the exit. Okay, and some of them have found the exit, but because they didn't have the map, they didn't recognize it as such. And so the Bible has a few phrases for that. Okay, it's called blind leading the blind. So why are we listening to these guys? The Bible also has another verse that says, ever learning and never coming to the truth. They're always searching. They're always looking for an answer, but they're never going to find it. And I know why they're not going to find it is because they don't like the answer that's going to give.
Well, thank you for answering those responses to those objections. And now, before we close out the interview, I'd like to again discuss with you one of the fundamental principles of science. One of the hallmark tests that's normally applied to a scientific theory is that of falsifiability. And so with regard to the subject at hand, the question is begged, can the radioactive dating methods be falsified? And if so, how?
These dating methods all have falsifiable claims. Okay, and I'll just give one example here with the potassium, using the potassium argon dating, because that's just an easy example. Okay, the dating method requires that there be no argon in the lava when it's melted, because it should leak out. So you can test that. How much argon is in fresh lava or freshly hardened lava? That's an easy test. And we've always found that there's what they call excess argon, which means there's so automatically that method should be proven false from the get-go because its fundamental principle is false. The clock can't be set. So this method should be dismissed entirely. Yet it's being used according to one article I found, it's being used to test the age of Mars right now. So they obviously have not. They know there's a problem, but they haven't discarded it. Okay, when I did my interview with Douglas Sharp on Revolution Against Evolution, is that I just went through the radioactive decay equation, and I just pointed out, okay, what's falsifiable within each variable of that equation? Each thing is falsifiable. Okay, and I won't have time to go into this today because we're already pushing on time here, and that's okay. But look at the test cases that I went out through in the previous session. Those are falsifiable. Those are areas where the methods are falsifiable. Where is the problem going wrong? Does the methods handle things that are outside the scope of where it's supposed to be used? Those are falsifiable areas where you can claim. And every time that the younger creationists have tested these things, they always show to be erroneous in some way, shape, or form. Okay, the times where the dates actually agree with the deep time history, those are the outliers. Not it's not the dates that disagree that are the outliers. It's the dates that do agree that are the outliers when you look at the full realm of data. So I would never use these methods because I can't trust them. And again, when they're defending these methods, they're not giving me scientific reasons to trust them. They're not giving me the tests that show that they're valid. They're just giving me all they say is like we can get repeated results the same way each time. Really, it's not happening. So how can and usually what I'm giving is like these methods are totally trustworthy and we have no reason to question them. After all, how can so many thousands of scientists be wrong? Well, thousands and thousands upon scientists thought that heavier objects fell faster than lighter objects. Thousands of scientists thought you could cure someone of a disease by bleeding them out. So many times, the modern consensus and the majority, they have a long history of being wrong. I don't remember who quoted it. Who said this. It might be Richard Feynman, but I think it was someone else. But Charles Jackson will quote him all the time. But they said that science has a long history of trying not to fool ourselves. And that's what's going on here. Evolutionists are trying to come up with a history that is different from the Bible. That's ultimately what they're after. And so as a result, they're going to come up with whatever kind of scientific means they can to back it up. And frankly, I find that they actually don't care about the science. They don't care about the data. They just care about their history has to be valid and the Bible's history cannot be valid. And ultimately, that's a moral choice. What's driving this is not it's not science, it's not facts, it's morality. Because if the biblical history is true, that means that the God of the Bible is true, and that the God of the Bible holds us morally accountable to how we want to live our lives. And that's ultimately what's behind the scenes going on here.
So, Charlie, we're actually on our second to last question. And since we've been speaking so much about paradigms, what questions now would you pose to someone who does attest to the deep time history paradigm?
I'll cover this in a little bit more detail in my next session with the with my own research, but just a few things. I would like to see experimentation that I can go validate myself. I would like to be able to see what their process is done in public. I'd like to see what their reasoning is behind how they choose and select their dates. Okay, so as I mentioned, as a physics teacher, if any of my students were to question what I tell them about gravity or about forces, we have experiments that can showcase how this works out. But how can we do this with deep time models? How can we actually go validate these? Okay, Ian Juby asked a heckling geology professor to go join him to use any method of his choice to go test the lava flows of the Uinkaret lava flows, which one thing I didn't mention in the last session, they found Indian artifacts in them. So, okay, the Uinkaret lava flows were the ones that are on top of the Grand Canyon, flowing into the canyon, each dating to be over a billion years old, into a canyon that's only less than 6 million years old. And they found Native American Indian artifacts in them that prove that the lavas have to be less than 800 years old. So, yeah, the list goes on. Okay, so Ian Juby asked his professor to go. Let's go calibrate these dating methods, knowing this history, and the professor refused to join him. I would also have to ask, give me experimentations that showcase the validity of these methods, not merely of when they are supposed to work, but how they handle when they're not supposed to work. And again, I will get into more of these questions in our final session later on today.
So now we've come to our final question. So we just touched on the paradigm of deep time. And so even so, Charlie, why should someone believe the Bible when it says that God created in 6 days?
Okay, I'll address two quick angles here. One angle is, what does the Bible actually say? That's where you start with. What does it actually say? It says 6 days. Okay, that's the plain English. By every hint of spelling, grammar, context, genre, etc., day means day. No question. Okay, people need to start being honest. If they're going to say like they don't think it means 6 days, they need to stop hiding. They need to just be upfront and say like they don't believe it. And it just baffles me that what they hide behind is illiteracy. We don't know what the word day means. And I'm serious, that's one of their arguments. Like, well, we're not sure that it actually means the word day. Then the other aspect, if we could, because their true reason for saying that it can't be 6 days is because they believe in the alternate history. When we take out the reasoning for believing in the alternate history, then suddenly the Bible has it standing all over again. Okay, so sometimes don't bother defending the Bible. Attack their objection, because usually their objection is what's invalid, and that's what we're doing. That's why we're doing this study on these dating methods. We're showcasing that these methods are not as valid as the scientists and as the media are leading us to believe. Okay, and I do think the ones that actually know about what's going on behind the scenes, I think they know it too, whether they agree with deep time or not. Okay, so why should someone believe the Bible when it says 6 days? And let's be this is a very critical question, because our youth are asking our church leaders that today. The president of Worldview Warriors, which is the ministry that I write for and blog for, when he was a youth, he asked his youth pastor about like, hey, what's up with these 6 days, and what's up with creation? And the youth pastor said, like, don't worry about Genesis, just focus on Christ. And the president realized that what this means is that realized what that meant. He realized, like, well, these church leaders don't actually believe this Bible that they proclaim to be God's word, and so why should I believe it? He ended up rejecting the entire Bible because of that, and lived as an atheist for a while. God did bring him back, and one of the catalysts for that was that he was consistent in what he believed. He did realize that evolution and deep time methods are by no means consistent in any way, shape, or form. They are simply not consistent. Okay. In the Bible, however, there's total consistency. There are no internal contradictions in the Bible. People have tried. They have tried, but they can't find a legitimate, authentic, actual contradiction that can't be reasonably understood and explained when dealing with like multiple witnesses. Okay. The few discrepancies in the Bible are even then they're completely meaningless to the actual context. They're usually like number disagreements or spelling errors. They have nothing to do with what's actually being said. So if we're going to believe that the Bible is indeed the inspired word of God, the revelation of God's message to mankind, sufficient for life and godliness, then what it says about creation also has to be true and valid. And guess what? It's part of that gospel message too. I did mention this in our off-camera time, but one of the books I'm editing right now is on. I'm calling it the Doctrines of Genesis, and what I'm doing is that I'm taking the Apostles and Nicene creeds, combining their statements, and I'm showcasing how every single line and tenet of these creeds that every single denomination agrees with has their some kind of root or foreshadow or seed form established in the first chapters of Genesis, and that it happens with every single line and tenet of the core doctrines of Christianity. Okay, so just to make it clear, I will not state it is necessary for someone to believe in a 6-day creation to be saved. Okay, because all of us have things that are have things that we don't agree with that are essential parts of the gospel message. Okay, so it's not our belief in 6 days that saves us. However, the fact of 6-day creation and all that comes with it is foundational to salvation even being an option. Because under all the secular models, whether they recognize it or not, there is death before sin. And if death preceded sin, then death could not be the penalty of sin. And what Jesus did on that cross is completely meaningless. If old earth creation is true, then no one is saved. Because Jesus' work on the cross didn't do anything, because sin didn't do anything. That is why the secularists and the deists came up with these deep time ideas to attack Genesis ultimately as an attack on Christ and the work on the cross. And our theologians need to get a handle of this thing, because what they are teaching is completely contradictory to the parts of the gospel that they are so good at explaining, but they getting the foundation wrong. And as a result, they're unwittingly leading people astray as a result of that.
Charlie, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy to have you on again. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Charlie's website, his autobiographical information, his books, and his resources, and other creation links in the description below. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.